Hello, everybody. Very warm welcome to the Institute for Government. I'm Nicola Hughes, and I'm a senior researcher here. Thank you for dragging yourselves away from your Twitter screens and the exciting reshuffle news. Got a really great panel here today. 4 chief executives, no less, one of whom used to be my boss, so slightly daunting. So I'm just going to be very brief before we get onto them. So we've got Campbell Robb there from Shelter, Clare Pelham from Leonard, Cheshire, and Danny Kruger from Only Connect. And Dan Corry from NPC is going to be chairing today's event. They've all worked both in government in different roles and in the voluntary sector. Just to note, we did ask the minister to come today, but unfortunately he couldn't make it and has since moved on, I understand. So just briefly, the Institute for Government perspective on this. We've done a series of events recently, so we've looked at government and its relationship to the judiciary, government and its relationship to the business sector, and so it felt really natural to do something around government and the voluntary sector. I should say as well, when we say voluntary sector, we're using that as a bit of a catch-all. I know it's a very broad church encompassing lots of different sorts of organisations, but it's the best catch-all we have for the moment. And we've looked at this from a couple of angles. So first of all, government is interacting with the voluntary sector a lot in public services. So we've got more and more charities, big service delivery organisations, working with government to sort of deliver social outcomes and dealing with this new world of contracting and payment by results. And we have produced some research on that with Collaborate, which I would urge you all to read, on how that sort of change is impacting the sector. We're also really interested in this because policy making is a huge part of effective government. And government's really been trying to sort of open up policy making to involve people who deliver policy at an earlier stage, those implementation experts, which very often involves the voluntary sector. And I've been running a programme in partnership with the Big Lottery Fund, which brings together people who work in Whitehall on policy issues, Whitehall policymakers, there's one at the back there, and people who deliver services on the front line to see actually what they can learn from each other. So quite different from the usual sort of campaigning, lobbying relationship, but actually working together on projects and trying to sort of solve cross-cutting policy issues. So, government's interacting with the sector all the time, both from departments. So if you think of, DFID working with foreign aid agencies, whether it's justice working with people on probation contracts, or the units in the Cabinet Office who are trying to think about the sector a bit more strategically. And we're interested in how that relationship works. So, does government even need to manage the sector at all? That's some of the issues our panel are going to be touching on today. A couple of bits of housekeeping, first of all. So the format of the event is going to be fairly straightforward. We'll have introductory remarks from all the speakers, then a chance for you to ask questions. So please do get involved then. We are on the record and we'll be videoing the event and putting it online afterwards. So just so you know, don't say anything too sort of libelous or scandalous. And please do tweet if you can tear yourselves away from hashtag reshuffle onto hashtag volsec. Your tweets and comments very, very welcome. And I'll hand over to Dan to chair. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nicola, and thanks to you and the Institute for putting this on. I've been trying to encourage this event for a while, and the reason is in the past I worked in government as an advisor in different departments, and so kind of experienced the way that different departments as well as the centre were trying to interact with the non-profit charity sector. And then I now run an organisation called New Philanthropy Capital, NPC, which is a charity that works as a think tank and a consultancy. And so we're working with the sector, both the charities, the funders, the philanthropists, the charitable foundations, and so on. And so we see from their perspective how they find the relationship with government. And so the question, in a sense, is, are we organising it correctly at the moment? Is Whitehall organising things by having an office of third sector or civil society? Is that the right way to go? Does that allow other departments to say, well, we don't have to worry about that sector because there's some guys in the Cabinet Office that do that? Is it relevant to charities, since a lot of them, most charities have a particular focus, so they have a relationship much more with the department rather than with the centre? And in any case, if we're really having localism, does any of this matter at all? And really, the aim of today is to explore these issues and to think whether we can do things a bit better. And as Nicola said, we've got 3 speakers that you're going to hear from, all of whom have got fantastic experience to have a go at these kind of issues. We're going to start off, I'll introduce them all first and then so I don't have to say that again. I'm going to start with Campbell Robb, who is Chief Exec of Shelter, who have interesting relationships with government all the time. And before that, he was Director General of the Office of the Third Sector, and before that, he's got a long career NCVO, so has got bruises from all sides, I'm sure. Clare Pelham, who's the Chief Executive of Leonard, Cheshire, and very involved in all the disability charities when they get together and trying to campaign for things. And she has a long civil service career as well, and I don't know whether she'll tell us about her bruises. And then we've got Danny Kruger, who's chief exec of the charity Only Connect, which is a crime prevention charity. He's been involved in the think tank world as an advisor to Ian Duncan Smith, Michael Howard, to the Conservative Party, and he wrote speeches for David Cameron. So he's obviously seen it through a political lens as well, a little bit like as I have from one side. And then now trying to run a charity and be interested to hear what he thinks of government in action as opposed to in theory. But we're going to start off with Campbell.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I just wanted to, I've been asked specifically to talk particularly about my experience and understanding of getting a unit set up in the centre of government to interact with the voluntary sector, and then what my reflections on it were. I'll try and keep my comments on the wider issues to kind of the comments at the end. Just to paint you a little bit of a picture, in 2006, before we had an Office of Civil Society or Office of the Third Sector, there was roughly about 160,000 voluntary organisations employing about 2.2% of the workforce, which was around 600,000 people, and they had an income of about £35 billion per year. What you might call is quite a significant part of the economy, roughly speaking. At the time, central government's main way of interacting that was a unit in the Home Office at then called the Active Communities Unit, in the previous, which had about 50 people in it. In the previous 8 years, it's also been in the Department of National Heritage and for a brief time in CLG. It didn't have a dedicated minister. In fact, on occasions, it didn't have a minister at all. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong or right, but if you compare it to a sector of a similar size in 2006, which, for example, farming, which had 500,000 people working in it, so therefore less, it had a whole department to itself. So you can choose whether you think that's a right or wrong analogy to make, but that was the reality of the situation that existed before you had a centralised thing. No diss on the Active Communities Unit. I see old colleagues from there sitting there right now giving me the eye. So, but why do you need an office like an Office of the Third Sector? I'm going to give you two quotes. I'm going to ask you to name which Prime Minister said these. The first quote: "The government and the sector fulfil complementary roles in the development and delivery of public policy and services, and that government has a role in promoting voluntary community activity in all areas of our national life." Quote 1. Quote 2: "Looking forward, the role of this sector has never been more important. Getting citizens more engaged, involved and responsible for the communities around them will only be possible in partnership with the sector. Improving and delivering better, more responsive public services can only be done with the help of the sector, and empowering communities can only work with the skills, enthusiasm and commitment that the sector is harnessed." Two quotes, two Prime Ministers, one Tony Blair, one David Cameron. Absolutely, virtually and utterly no differential between those quotes whatsoever in their understanding about what they see. That's why you have at the very senior levels of politics people beginning to understand, from Blair, probably the first Prime Minister that really began to understand and see a real and true and genuine value. John Major, to be fair, had a particular view of it and encouraged it in a very specific way around volunteering, but as seeing it as a real driver of public service reform and a whole range of things. So up front, from my perspective, the government and the voluntary sector will always have an ever-changing and flexible and, let's be frank, odd relationship. It needs to be, in my opinion, do two separate things that needs to be kept separate. The first is that while we have something such as charitable status, and that status confers some benefits in terms of both status and financial reward, it's absolutely and utterly right for the government to set parameters on this. It must protect that, it must protect the public purse, it must protect that status and its thing, and it must do that by Parliament, not by government, and by a regulator. And the regulator, as all regulators should be independent of the sector and of government and report to Parliament. Fair, you put that aside, let's leave that in a sense. You can argue about that, but for me that's a given. The second thing is the government needs to, and let's not talk about, I feel like being a history student again when you want to challenge the question. I think anybody trying to manage the voluntary sector would die trying before they got even close to doing it. So it needs, however, government does need a means to communicate with, provide support and assistance to, negotiate and consult with that wider set of organisations and organisations of civil society. It's not about control or funding, but recognition that the sector plays a large part in the nation's health and well-being, and having, as both those Prime Ministers recognised, a successful, powerful and competent part of government is likely to help that government. You need to recognise that a small, and it should be small, unit can't represent all organisations. It's not there to do it. The large charities like Shelter will do it themselves, and the small ones generally want nothing to do with central government apart to be left alone by it. However, a unit accumulate knowledge, it can an understanding, it can prevent unintentional bad and promote good behaviour in consultation and in funding. It can make the case for issues that affect all in the sector. A very, very good example of this is in volunteering practice. CRB checks, which many of you now take for granted, are free for volunteers. At the time of the introduction, there was a massive drive in government to be self-funding. That agency needed to be self-funding, and therefore, why would it want to give away a huge amount of its voluntary checks to do that? Many of us ran a campaign about calling that tax and volunteering. If you're going to volunteer for something, you had to pay £10 up front. It's going to put people off. You have a unit in the centre of government that can negotiate and make that case. You stop bad things happening at the very least, and you might actually make good things happening. So you can have a unit and a place in the centre of government that acts as that conduit, that place and that space to do that. I mean, there are many reasons, but for me, the true goal of whatever the office is to have a respected and consistent place at the centre of government which could make the case for the benefits of a strong, vibrant civil society. It's also critical for me that this office, which has survived beyond one government and became an established part of the Whitehall machinery. So, very briefly, what lessons did I learn about setting up and creating an office which has survived that change of government, which still exists through different political parties? In fact, it's survived 3 elections, but a change of party as well, which seems to me to become part of that established thing. It absolutely, utterly needs and needed political will to establish and maintain this type of office, particularly one that represents such a diverse and relatively unrepresented and voter-friendly sector. It has to be set up against the will, and this Office of Third Sector was definitely set up against the will of the then civil service, and I suspect it needs more and more political pressure to keep it in that place and keep the forces of diffusion to give it that sense that it needs to be central. Absolutely critical to me that it sits in the centre of government. All of the evidence that I've seen before or since that the government sector represents need to exist outside one department. Otherwise, it gets subsumed by the agenda of that department, or it becomes a bargaining chip in all of those Whitehall turf wars that people see, well, we'll give you that if you give us that. Or, as can happen, other departments ignore it if they see with someone else's responsibility. The other critical thing for any relationship between government and the voluntary sector is that it has to be inclusive of HMT. It needs the Treasury to be engaged. It needs to have a view on it. It doesn't need to have that uber support that it had under the Brown Chancellorship, but it does need a sympathetic ear in the Treasury to understand both funding regimes and the tax regime as well. It also needs a dedicated civil servant, a dedicated minister and a senior civil servant. It needs that seniority to drive it and to give it credibility. It doesn't need to be some superstar, but someone who cares. Nick Hurd seemed to certainly do that at OCS in the last government. Phil Hope was that type of minister who understood, was respected, could negotiate and bargain across government, and having a senior civil servant who can get into the types of discussions and meetings that I was able to do because of my status as a Director General really helped. You also need champions. It's absolutely clear, and friends across all government departments, you can't rely on the centre to do it. The OCS may still do. We had a network of grade 3 and grade 7 champions, some of whom were here. Jill, I think, was a grade 3 champion for the Office of Civil Society, the Office of Civil Sector, who were there, and they made a huge difference to have people in a department. We're never going to win over a whole department. They were never going to change the whole culture of that department, but they were there, and it was somebody you could talk to and understand. One of the questions I was asked to reflect on was whether having a central place in government like the Office of Civil Society is whether or not it acts as a conduit for transfer of people in and out of government. Actually, in my experience, and Clare will talk about, actually recently, in the last 10 years, the transfer hasn't been from the sector into government, it's been from government out into the voluntary sector. That's no bad thing either. But I had to believe when I was made the Director General of the Office of the Third Sector, it wasn't because I happened to be from the sector. Gus O'Donnell may tell me differently, but he hired me because I thought I was the best candidate for the job. When I got the job, I wasn't a representative of the sector, I was a civil servant. My job, as all civil servants was to be a representative to ministers, to give ministers the best possible advice. That has to be the case. An office in the centre of government isn't a champion. It would never have worked. We would have lost The rest of the civil service thought we were some insurgent political fad led by someone from the voluntary sector that they could ignore for long enough, who hadn't become a Director General on the sly, and that we needed to do that. So our approach, and the approach that I would absolutely recommend, is completely the opposite. We had to out civil service the civil service, we had to be better prepared, better research, and we had to have the best people. It didn't matter if they came from the voluntary sector, the civil service, or for business. In fact, in the office of the third sector, we had people from all three of those things, and we had to take on and work to prove ourselves to do that. And I think that's one of the reasons why it has stayed and it's survived. I think that just to say that I've been working at this interface between the sector and government since about 1998, and things have changed and a lot has stayed the same. But I absolutely believe that we do need a place whereby government and Whitehall can interact with the voluntary community sector, and that a central but small, powerful but thoughtful, minister-led, civil servant-run unit can and provide that type of interface that makes it work. But there is much more to do. Just to give you an example of where we need to go next, not long into my tenure at the Office of the Third Sector, I was with Phil Hope and Ed Miliband, the then ministers. It was Phil Hope and I, and we were in this special, just around the corner, in fact, just around the corner at Buckingham Palace, a kind of special event for volunteers where the Queen and Prince Philip were going to be handing out awards, and we were in a room just with myself. It was myself, Phil Hope, Phil Corby Hope, I'll call him, and Prince Philip. And Prince Philip turned around to, he was then the Minister for the Third Sector, and said to him, "So, what do you do?" to Phil Hope. Phil Hope said, "Well, I'm the Minister for the Third Sector." Prince Philip said, "What's that then?" Which was quite a reasonable question at the time. Nobody knew what the Third Sector was, but Phil Hope's answer at the time was, well, it's kind of, there's everything that isn't the public sector and everything that isn't the private sector. To which Prince Philip looked at him, cackled and said, "Third sector, third rate, I say," and walked off. So we've now cracked the civil service and government. It's only the royal family to go. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks a lot. I think we got a feel about why you were absolutely the right person to be that first director of the office. Claire, over to you.
Okay. So I'm not going to stand behind here because I'm not very tall. I feel a bit daunted, actually, because I didn't know half of that stuff, and I rather feel like I should have done. So I'm not going to talk at all about structures. I'm going to talk about behaviours, actually, because, and I will be that nerdy history student, because I think it's the wrong question. How should the government manage the relationship? It absolutely shouldn't manage the relationship. What's that about? If there is to be a relationship between these two parties, these very different sorts of people, you know, a group of people, let's face it, who quite like order and no surprises and structure, and a group of people who are a bit more free-spirited, perhaps. You know, it should not be a controlling relationship, it should be a different sort of relationship. Because not only are our structures, I mean, our culture's different, but actually our purposes are different. So I've only been in the charity world for 3 years, so I really absolutely know nothing much. But I do know that just imagine, when you're walking along the street and somebody puts a tin under your nose and you put a £1 coin in it, what do you think? Do you think, great cause, I really want to support homeless people in London? Do you think, I want to do something for disaster relief in Syria? Or do you think, gosh, I really hope this charity gets a bit closer to the government and manages its relationship well? Absolutely not. That's, you know, the purpose of the charity is for its beneficiaries. And I think it's true for government too. I mean, when you troll along to the primary school and put an X on a piece of paper, you might be thinking about the economy, you might be thinking about Europe, you might be thinking about Iraq or Syria. You're not thinking, could the government control those pesky charities? No, completely different kettles of fish, actually. Completely different cultures and completely different primary purposes, but a common bond in the sense that they're both groups of people trying to make things better in the world that we live in. So I think we do need to rub along well, but I don't think it needs to be a controlling relationship. I think it should probably be one that's freely entered into, and hey, call me radical, it should be like something about equality of esteem and respect and all of that stuff. So, if it's that sort of relationship, it probably needs some guiding principles. So, call me unoriginal, but I went for 3, because it's always got to be 3, hasn't it? So I went for love, honour and obey. So love. It's pretty difficult to be in a relationship with somebody that, well, I'm not saying we go straight to love, but at least you have to like them. You do have to like each other for the relationship to work. And I know that lots and lots of people in the voluntary sector don't think the government likes them very much, actually. They think, the government thinks that paid charity staff are pretty much a load of overpaid bureaucrats getting in the way of worthwhile volunteers doing great things on the ground. And this is slightly funny in some ways, an unnecessary layer of bureaucracy with their own private political agendas, going on the Today programme at the drop of a hat to pursue those agendas, and using as a basis for their criticisms of the government a lot of half-baked statistics. Now, I don't think that's true, but that's what a lot of people think. And I think that gets in the way of the liking. And I think the other side of the coin, a lot of people think that folk in charities think that government is slow, glacially slow, unresponsive, has 1,001 reasons for not doing anything at all, drones on endlessly about not having any money, but then spends it like it's going out of fashion. And, you know, occasionally there might be muttering about they don't give up their evenings to sell raffle tickets, do they? So I don't think we like each other very much, and I think that's because we don't know each other very well. And that's a great thing, because that's really easy to put right, actually. I reflect back on my time when I was a civil servant. I think I was pretty rubbish at getting alongside people from the world of charities. Even though I used to, in the evenings, like lots of people do, go off and volunteer, I never somehow thought of it as part of what I was doing, which is a bit bizarre, really. But lots of departments are doing great work in volunteering. Great work. Volunteering in itself is great, but what's also good is it brings them closer to an understanding of the people they're interacting with, or should be interacting with. And I don't mean painting a shed in a field, but I do mean sitting down with beneficiaries and staff and volunteers and getting to know each other a bit. Shadowing, good. Seconding, good. Bit of trust, good. Going for a drink together, good. Coffee, all good. All good. Building trusts and understanding. Because if you don't, it is like a marriage, this, it really is. If you don't talk to each other, how can you understand each other? How can you trust each other? And I don't mean that, with the greatest respect, that leaky thing that goes on in pubs where, you know, we all sit in dark corners and tell each other stuff we shouldn't. I wouldn't know about that. But I do mean a bit of empathy. I don't know this personally, but I was told by a well-placed source, really sad about a charity that had to close down a service and make all the staff redundant 3 days before the funding came through that would have secured their future. Now, if somebody in the department had only picked up the phone and said, guys, I know this is really important to you, can you hang on for another week? Think how much better the world would be if we did that sort of exchange. And this one I do know about, a department that worked for a long time on a policy announcement. They were desperate to get it warmly welcomed by the sector. There was a bit of confusion, they slipped the date. I don't know why, we never did quite find out why. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the announcement came out in the week we were all away at a couple of conferences. We didn't even notice. You know, just a shame. Why didn't we tell them we weren't going to be away? We were going to be away that week. It's just a shame. So it's good to talk, good to understand, good to empathise, and good to honour. So that's what this picture is about. And I'm going to leave it to you to work out which is which. But this is intended to represent the two parties in this relationship. One is a beautiful wild meadow with plants growing opportunistically and randomly. And the other is an equally beautiful, very structured garden in which all the plants grow in straight lines. Who knows? Who knows which is better? They're both beautiful. And we need to respect each other's difference. And we need to value each other's integrity. I think there are a lot of people in this room who wouldn't be amazed to find out that government does stuff wrong all the time. Files get lost, things don't get announced that should have been announced, people don't turn up for meetings. And I think, in all honesty, I think sometimes charity people are a bit touchy about it, a bit sensitive, it feels a bit personal. Why did they do that to me? Sorry, it was just a mistake, get over it, toughen up a bit, you know, show a bit of understanding. And also, you know, sometimes there's a bit of misunderstanding the other way too, which is, this one I do know about. If policy folk from a campaigning team are working in a working group with you, working on regulations, constructively engaged with you, and then you announce the regulations to a great fanfare, are you really surprised to find them on the Today programme saying they think the regs could have been better? The word I wouldn't use for that is betrayal, but that is what the civil servant said. You betrayed me. Now that doesn't feel, I think, to the people in the civil service campaign, in civil service world, like an honourable act, but to the charity people it felt absolutely natural. We weren't agreeing with you, we were just trying to moderate the worst of what you were doing there, guys. Of course, we're always going to be campaigning for our beneficiaries. So there's something about respecting each other's difference and each other's integrity and each other's primary purpose. And just to touch on public service provision and whether that's right for the voluntary sector. And I think that's where the biggest gulf of misunderstanding can sometimes occur. A lot of charities worry about contracting with the public sector because they think it might compromise their independence. They think government might ask them to toe the line in some way. Personally, I think it's a good thing because I think if you have a diversity of service provision, you get more choice, more creativity, you can attract voluntary income in and volunteers into making services better for the people who receive them. But we have to do it carefully and we have to do it within a framework. So that brings me on to obedience. So obey. Obedience, compliance, regulation, whatever we call it, there's a heck of a lot of it about. And I sometimes think, be careful or government, you might kill the thing you're trying to love here. So even the largest charities usually only have one person to deal with the whole of government regulation, all of it. And I just think sometimes just show a bit of empathy. All of this is vectoring in on one person. You know, just be aware that you need to give us space to do the things that we do well. And I think also sometimes the voluntary sector is a little bit self-righteous. Just because our cause is right doesn't mean that we're above the law, doesn't mean that we don't have to comply, doesn't mean we shouldn't do things properly, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be transparent and all of those things. So that's about, you know, finding what's a reasonable amount of regulation and ensuring that we do it well. So we've got here a sort of recipe for a happy marriage, really, love, honour and obey. And I was asked to say a little word about this coordinating structure thing. So in my model, Nick Hurd was the marriage guidance counsellor. It's a pity he isn't here, actually, because I was going to say a lot more about it. But I don't know what he does. I suspect it's probably quite useful. I've never had cause to find out. If the relationship's in trouble, I might one day pop along there and find out. It's probably a good thing, but I have not a clue. Not a clue. Anyway, that's probably enough from me.
Fantastic stuff. Love, honour and obey. So follow that, Danny. Thank you.
Well, I represent the smallest charity, so we work in... have I got two microphones going? Okay. We work just in London, and we work in prisons and schools, and we have two little community centres we run, and we work with job centres and people referral units, and we work with prisoners, ex-offenders and youth at risk of offending. That's our target group. Before that I worked in the Tory world before they were in government, so I've never worked in government, and I did a lot of the sort of working on the policy and the sort of rhetoric around big society and social responsibility and all that good stuff, if you recall. Just politically, what I think is what I'm here for, is to talk about the big society. I always think it was a really successful brand. It didn't work in its primary purpose of communicating much, but I think it communicated an idea which actually resonated and worked for people. And the fact that people said they didn't understand it, well, I think they just didn't like it. They didn't like the idea that government was talking to them about what's essentially voluntary action, quite rightly. But they did get it, and I think we all get the idea that communities should be more self-reliant. We should be looking out for our neighbours. We should be taking more responsibility for ourselves and the people around us, that communities could have more power. So I think the language around big society was useful and had some cut-through, and in fact it did have real cut-through because it really connected with people. It just didn't work as any sort of political strategy, and I think that's the significant point about this topic, which is that a top-down bit of rhetoric, an agenda or a policy platform, which is really about people in government telling society what to do, is completely inimical and contrary to the very spirit of the message. So it was never going to work as that sort of political campaign. In terms of the relationship, for me, they need to be adversarial. I don't agree with the marriage metaphor. I agree with the principle of being civil to each other and getting along, and there's a need for all this good stuff in terms of relationships. But actually, the whole point is that we have, and I think Claire's point was, that these sectors are extremely different. They're entirely separate entities. And there has to be an adversarial relationship between the agency of coercion, which is government, and the voluntary sector, all the multiple agencies which work through people's non-coerced activity. They're not being funded through compulsory contributions. I think the principle of the two agencies, or the set of agencies, is completely different. And the importance of the sector is that it, even without reference to all the amazing good work that we all do, it's that we occupy this important role in terms of giving texture to our democracy by filling this space in the public sphere, which is not part of the coercive apparatus of government. We represent these mediating institutions between citizens and the state, and we give people the opportunity to come together and to form, to make collective action in a way that does not involve participation in government. And that, I think, is a vital part of a healthy democracy, and it staves off what might be called majoritarianism, the idea that just because a sufficient number of people have elected a government, that is the only show in town, that's the only worldview that should be felt in civic life. So I think the independence of the sector is crucial from that respect. In terms of what the attitude should be, I very much agree in practice with what Claire was saying about how the sectors should work together. And as I say, I run a very small charity by standards of these other guys. And our relationships are mostly with local government and with other commissioners. And most of our relationships are with the private, independent philanthropists, trusts and foundations, corporates and so on. So, but insofar as we talk to government or to the statutory sector, it's with local government. And there, yes, everything we've heard is I agree with. It's all about the relationships. We've got to show some understanding. These guys are just as chaotic and dysfunctional as we are. It's not for any, I always say it's not for us, it's not for me or anyone in my organisation to criticise anyone else in any office that we deal with, because anything that they do wrong, we've done it wrong too. So I never want to get into that kind of slagging off mentality that is so tempting when you're suffering from mistakes made elsewhere. It is really hard, this work, for all of us. So a bit of respect and empathy is really helpful. Let me just speak lastly about the agenda that I understand this government's pursuing, which is largely around outsourcing, contracting out what were public sector responsibilities. And for me, just to speak very bluntly and quickly about this, I think I'm overwhelmingly in favour of the principle, because I think what we're actually seeing is a lot of public services returning to their roots in the voluntary sector. If we remember how most of our public services began, they began as the voluntary expression of citizens coming together because they saw a social problem and they wanted to alleviate it. So from the NHS to probation to all sorts of agencies, the origins were voluntary, and I think that it is a positive step that we're seeing the opportunity for organisations like ours to get involved again in the delivery of those services. I think particularly of transforming rehabilitation, which is the probation reforms, incredibly problematic, doomed to screw up in one way or another, no doubt. And yet, the principle behind it, I think, absolutely right. There is naturally very real and legitimate concerns about the commercialisation of public services. And that is the thing that needs to be watched. But insofar as these reforms give the opportunity to smaller organisations like us to move from the periphery to begging for scraps from the taxpayer to delivering services that we're actually best placed to deliver because of our position in the community, with the way we can work, then I think that's a wholly good thing. And moving forward, having said that the statutory sector is all about coercion, I think that's right. And yet, if we think about the future of public services, if we think about what matters in terms of the next stage of reform, we all increasingly recognise that what matters in addressing the social problems we're familiar with, it's about working more over the long term, it's about working more relationally. So thinking about, in healthcare, it's not just about a doctor prescribing an intervention and never seeing the patient again, it's about managing a long-term relationship with that patient and in fact helping that patient manage their own condition, increasing focus on prevention and on working over the long term. All of this is perfect territory for the independent sector to be working in. And my dream and aspiration for the next government, if it's the Tories, is that they will have the courage to exhume the big society rhetoric and theme and talk in terms of what the independent sector, the social sector, the voluntary sector can do to deliver change in my area, which is youth and ex-offenders, but across the piece, from early years right up to older years, working with independent organisations to develop long-term preventative relational models of work. And I don't think that's something that can be done through a centralised government bureaucracy. So I hope that they will see the value of that agenda. And lastly, in terms of what the sector's role, we've lost our pretty picture, but I would say less meadow, more well-ordered, French geometric gardens would be good, because I think that having always been in the thousand flowers blooming motif is a tremendous one, and very Tory, I would say. But it's problematic. I mean, I run this little organisation. There are hundreds of other organisations pretty much the same as us in working in similar ways with similar sorts of people in London. We don't know each other. We're slightly adversarial towards them. We might pretend to be friends, but we're not. We're fighting over funding. We're all in our own ways pretty unaccountable to anybody. We're certainly bad at relating to the statutory sector or the commercial sector. All of these problems, and yet we're all basically trying to do the same thing. We've got a shared mission, really, in practice, or in theory. So why don't we actually come together and organise ourselves to deliver this great goal of collective impact, which I think is the holy grail for charitable activity. And I think that is the future for us lot. We need to, the energy of our sector often derives from these egotistical chief executives who, found their own charities and want to be king of their own kingdoms. But also we are the problem because we are jealous and defensive and resistant to collaboration. So I think if we were to get our act together, and if government were to recognise the power of our sector, if we were only to work together, I think we could do some great things.
Thanks a lot, Danny. I have to say that I spent a lot of my time in Whitehall trying to do what was called joined-up government. But when you come to the charity sector, yeah, it's a whole other ball game. It really is. Everyone's fighting stuff. Before I open it up, I just want to take Clare and Danny, your view, because Campbell was very clear that he felt that it was very important to have a minister that sort of represented the sector or something, and an office and a senior civil servant. And the way both of you spoke, you sort of didn't care either way. Or was I picking that up wrong, Clare?
Well, I come from a position of profound ignorance, really, which is we just have no interaction at all. So I'm sure they're doing good.
So if you take something like you've been having a campaign at Leonard, Cheshire about the 15-minute visits and so forth, you would never think that the Office of Civil Society or whatever might be someone who might sort of argue the case or so forth. So when those round the table at cabinet or whatever, you'd be talking just to the health people. You don't really care whether there's anyone who cares about the sector as a whole.
Well, I sort of. It didn't occur to me to think that they might help. It's probably my ignorance, but if I had thought about it, I'd have assumed they were too busy really doing sort of big strategic things to worry about a sort of specific health issue, a health and social care issue.
Well, later tonight we might see if someone brave from the OCS here will tell us what they actually do all the time. What do you think, Danny?
Well, I think Nicola was told to go in there and do not, show not tell. Do the big society. Don't go on about it. Don't go out there and don't make a big noise. So. There's a sort of deliberate below-the-radar operation, which I think has been a problem because I think he's done a perfectly good job and is a very good guy, completely his heart's in the right place on all of this, I think. But what we've lacked is the Prime Minister leading this agenda and I think he should be the Minister for the Third Sector. you know, he should be there, as he was in opposition, proclaiming the value of independent civic action to change society, to make things work better. And I think there's been a sort of political reluctance to go into this territory, and I think that's the great shame. So that's what I would like to have seen more. In terms of the sort of operational, and we're too small, and I think he's probably been very useful in terms of strategic stuff, and I know that he's been useful on the TR agenda to try and get Chris Grayling to think about the impact of the reforms on the smaller voluntary players. So I think he's probably been doing good work behind the scenes, but he hasn't been the champion. He hasn't been licensed to be the champion that I think we needed.
Thank you. So which just goes to show that structures, don't necessarily give people license,
Yeah.
so that's as important. Okay, I'm to take some contributions from the back, and then we'll come back to the panel. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Some microphone there. Yeah, you say who you are, please, first.
My name's Avi Bram from Department for Business Innovation and Skills. A couple of years ago, Fraser Nelson said that charities were stuffed to the gunwales with Labour placemen, and possibly he had some of the panel in mind when he said that. And just today, there was going to be a Westminster Hall debate about political neutrality amongst charities, which I think has had to be called off. But in any case, I was wondering what your opinion was on whether a perception maybe amongst certain Conservative politicians of left-wing bias amongst charities has been making things more difficult or has been troubling that relationship that we're talking about. And I'm thinking specifically about terms in the recent Lobbying Act, which place certain limits on charity campaigning and so on.
Okay, thank you. Very topical question. Gentleman there.
Lester Holloway from Voice for Change England. I was a bit surprised to hear Danny Kruger call for the restoration of the Big Society agenda. I mean, surely one of the reasons why it's perhaps off the agenda is because it was widely derided, and so therefore don't charities have the obligation and the duty, if you like, to go out and sell it to the public in order for David Cameron or any political party to rejuvenate this agenda? If I can just ask a second question very quickly, if I may. There's been a lot of debate, certainly around the reshuffle about diversity in government and in politics. But do you think that also needs to be reflected with the debate within the charitable sector, within the third sector, about our own diversity?
Okay, and then we're over here. There's one at the back first, and then the lady at the front.
David Walker from Guardian Public. To answer Dan Corry's question, surely OCS is completely irrelevant. If you look at the substantive social policies enacted by the present government, the rehabilitation revolution, aka the privatisation of probation, the effect on housing associations of welfare reform, the work programme, education at large, what's been happening in health and childcare. These policies have been pursued at best with a highly instrumental view of the voluntary sector as an add-on to private provision. But the idea that there's been in any of these areas a more strategic view of the sector as a whole is just not borne out by the facts. And Danny Kruger may tell us that there's been conversation between Chris Grayling and individual charities, but he has not approached that particular reform, like his colleagues, with any general conception of the voluntary sector, its potential or its well-being.
Okay, that's a bit of a downer on the OCS, and then the lady here.
Thanks. Becky Allen from the Hansard Society. I just wondered what the panel's thoughts were on the Lobbying Act and whether that is the right way to regulate charities, or whether what the government should have done if they don't agree.
Okay, well, we've got two questions really at different aspects of kind of the Lobbying Act and charities' role. And I'm going to try and keep the focus a bit, because there's so many things we can talk about, but really about, does it matter what structure we have for Whitehall's interaction with the charity sector, or does it not? Either because it doesn't seem to have any influence on anything, or people would rather have different relationships. But in a sense, so one set of questions there, though, was does that relationship get harder because of perceptions within government, perhaps, of what the charity sector is? Then we've obviously had a view that in a sense, the OCS is pointless an office like that. You might argue, to put the counter view, that the charity sector would always like its voice put at the table when decisions are being made. Doesn't mean you win all the debates, of course you don't. But, you know, if you didn't have that office, would those arguments be made at all at the table that matters? And then there's issues about almost the sector's responsibility for pushing the big society. If we think it's a good idea, really, and that ministers have found it difficult to run with it, maybe we should. Campbell, do you want to have a first bash at these?
Of course. I'm going to start with, a general point about, before I go into the Lobbying Act, a general point about political placement and things like that. I think that I absolutely agree with Danny. The thing we always say at Shelter, if people aren't firing at us, then we're doing something wrong. If we're not stirring it up, if we're not making people annoyed and angry, if people aren't responding to it, we aren't putting the truth of what's happening to homeless people in the streets, then we're not doing our job. We've got to constantly, whatever the government, I've been hauled into number 10 as the Chief Executive of Shelter when there's a Labour government and torn a strip for giving them a hard time. I've been taken into number 10 in a Conservative government and torn off a strip for making life difficult. I'm doing something right, in my opinion, if that's the case. So I think that, however, I think there is an atmosphere at the moment, and the Lobbying Act defines that as well, and it's not a political point, but it's absolutely, I might even get arrested, I think, now for saying something like this, but is that there is a danger that because the agenda of this government has been so forthright and so clear about certain things, and those who have objected to it, and because the Labour Party for a long period of time hasn't, we have had those in the charity world have had their only opposition to some of the reforms have been charities, that we become de facto the opposition. Regardless of whether we're from Labour or wherever we're from, we have become the opposition, and we've been challenged because of that. I think the Lobbying Act is a travesty. It will be unimplementable. I think it is dangerous for democracy, and I really don't think it does what the government wanted to do in the first place. So I think it's a waste of time and space. I think there is a dangerous atmosphere around. The whole point of civil society is to be able to speak truth to power. We and I recognise absolutely the democratic right of political parties. They are the democratic force. I vote. I have the right to vote. I don't complain about politicians. I think politicians do a really difficult job, and they do it as well as they can in the circumstances. But saying that, we should have the right and ability to do that, and to do that openly, I think. So I don't think the Lobbying Act is the right vehicle for doing that. I think we should have a dialogue and a better understanding between government and the civil society about what that form takes and what means that is. But Shelter, we're not going to stop complaining about what's happening to the most vulnerable people in the country, and we're not going to moderate that because of, in any way, because that's what we have to do. That's what our purpose is. That's why people donate to us. I think, David, that wasn't really a question. It was a statement, and it wasn't really. I think that the Office of the Civil Society, before 1998, who was making the argument for civil society? No one. Maybe the Guardian Society pages were, but the only places that you could find someone actually making the case for organised voluntary activity in civil society. There was a small unit in the Home Office who did very little. What it is not about making the case for Clare's campaign or for homelessness. It's about making the case for a vibrant civil society, for encouraging volunteering, for finding ways for government to encourage people to give money and to facilitate that kind of thing. I think that's a good thing. Its purpose is not to make government and to basically at times have a discussion with those departments who may then choose to ignore you, but at least they have to listen to you and make the case for better commissioning or better funding regimes or better grants. I think that's worth having. I think it's better than not having it.
Thanks a lot. Danny?
Well, just quickly, I rather agree with the point about the perception of political bias. I think that's probably the case, to be very blunt, that a lot of people in the government and in their sort of teams look suspiciously at what a lot of charities say and are very suspicious of the whole campaigning remit, the advocacy remit that charities have, and they think they should just get on with the work and not pay people to talk to them, do the work in the front line, which is a point of view, a legitimate one, but not that helpful. And I think in practice it leads into some strange decisions. So if you remember in the last government, in the last Parliament, the Conservatives got very friendly with London Citizens, with Citizens UK, and Steve Hilton, bless his memory, was all over them. And the whole National Citizen Service programme was born out of that relationship, really. And then in practice, when it came to be tendered, Citizens didn't get the contract. It went to somebody else who was seen to have a more sort of, a less adversarial, less left-wing worldview. And I think that's an example of where there was an attempt to reach across, actually, to where there was some genuine political opposition to a lot of what the Conservatives stood for, and it didn't come to much. It didn't lead to the right relationship. So I think there is that problem. I just agree with that. David Walker's point is well taken too. As I say, I think that it's very difficult for a middle-ranking minister who's pretty much told to keep his head down and not to cause any fuss to broker deals with cabinet ministers on major reforms that are going to deliver significant improvements in policy from the point of view of the voluntary sector. And like I say, I think that the missing voice has been the leaders. I think that we needed more oomph and sort of passion from the Prime Minister to have achieved those sorts of changes, because in practice, Chris Grayling's agenda is not about enhancing the voluntary sector. Frankly, no one's agenda should really be about enhancing the voluntary sector. We don't exist for our own purposes. We happen to think that the voluntary sector is good at serving the people we're here for. And that argument needed to be made to Chris Grayling more robustly than it was. His agenda was about delivering probation at a cost which he can afford. And he's gone for this approach, large-scale contracts to PLCs. But it's a shame that there wasn't more of an insistence that reform and others protected and gave adequate space and protection for smaller charities.
Thanks a lot, Danny. I would just add in defence of ministers of third sector and civil society. Ultimately, and it's true with any decent junior minister, if they need the minister from their department that goes to cabinet to argue for them, and if they're not, then they will never get anywhere. So that I think, you've been pointing the finger at the Prime Minister, you could point the finger at somebody else as well if you wanted to, and that was true in Labour governments as well. Claire?
I'd like to link the important point that was made about diversity with something that we haven't actually explicitly mentioned, but which seems to me the common theme here, which is about values. Let's start from the premise that we all believe in good manners and good behaviour, and that anything short of that is not how we want to work together. So I don't think it's appropriate for any minister to call in any charity leader and quote-unquote tear a strip off them. No, absolutely not. But nor do I think it's appropriate for us to campaign in a way that's rude and aggressive and personally insulting. I mean, we should all try to respect each other's point of view. And I just feel that whole adversarial world can lead us down the wrong track here. We're all trying to do the right thing for the right reasons. There has to be a constructive difference of opinion, and we have to find a way of managing that interaction which leads to some good outcomes. They may not all have a majority view. We may not be always happy with the decision of the government, but I hope that if I get passionate when I see a disabled person sitting in an incontinence pad all day because the local authority will not pay for them to have more than 15 minutes care per day, I hope that the minister I'm speaking to understands why I'm passionate. And equally, I understand that he has a lot of other things in his agenda that day, and sometimes he needs to look at his watch and say, that's enough from you today, Claire. But I do think it's important that we all try to behave well and that we all hold ourselves accountable, because I think, your point earlier, that there is a responsibility on us to be accountable to the people who support us, to our beneficiaries, to the people who give us money, and to act with humility. And there's also a responsibility on both sides to ensure that we employ a diverse range of people, not just box ticking. I could go on for hours and hours about the difficulties that disabled people have getting job interviews, but not just box ticking, but actually a full range of people with a full range of views and a full range of perspectives to put across the causes that we all believe in.
Thanks, Claire. I think you point to an interesting thing, actually. As if you work in government, you're lobbied all the time by all sorts of organisations. But charities are lobbying on behalf of their beneficiary groups, whereas, if you like, business organisations and lots of others are lobbying on behalf of their bottom line. Slightly different. So ministers need to take a slightly different view, as do civil servants, and I'm sure they try to. I'm sure we'll hear from a few in a minute. Right, I've got another round. There's two at the front and one at the back. And I've got three here. If everyone's short, I can do all of those.
Yes, my name is Sitvinder Kaur Stubbs, and I'm Senior Fellow at Collaborate. So, Nicola, thank you for the name check earlier on. We had a session last week with the Shadow Minister, Chiomara, about the relationship between government and the voluntary sector, were they to take power. And one of the things that she did was to criticise the antecedents of the voluntary sector in terms of its philanthropic beneficiary origins. And she drew a sharp distinction between social enterprises, mutuals, co-ops that she saw as being really at the heart of a socialist movement, and proposed that they would actually set up a centre for social enterprise if they got in. And I just wonder whether the concept of voluntary sector is actually outdated because it is too broad, and whether we ought to be looking at specific aspects of the sector and then the appropriate relationships with them.
Thank you. Massive issue. Is it one sector or is it lots and lots of different ones?
Hi, I'm Lucy de Groot. I'm Chief Executive of Community Service Volunteers. I was at the Treasury when, in fact, the Office of Civil Society was set up, and prior to that I was a local authority Chief Executive. I want to just pick up two, I think, points. One is the point that has been sort of hinted at, but I think is actually fundamental, which is exactly why it's the wrong question, which is that civil society exists, by, with and for, of itself as part of a wider democratic society. And if you care about democracy, whatever your politics, you have to believe in a vibrant, independent civil society, which includes faith groups, trade unions, social enterprises, individual charities, community groups, the whole caboodle. And I think I've become clear about that. I mean, I've been engaged with issues around sort of, democratic participation. We had a democracy review when I was Chief Executive of Bristol in the 1990s. We were worried deeply then about level of voter turnout, and compared to what it is now, it was unbelievably better. So there's a whole series of issues around democracy of which civil society is not the answer, but it's absolutely part of the answer. And I think it ill behoves anybody to lose that point. And if you look at around the world, that becomes really important. So I think the nature of the critique, it's not that we're beyond criticism, that is absolutely not the point, but you have to think about the nature of the critique. And that links to the fact I'm a trustee of the Bearing Trust, which for 20 years has put a lot of energy into reporting on the independence of the voluntary sector. And I think, again, some people, maybe it's a bit of history worth bearing in mind because they continually are doing a sort of review audit of that. The second thing I was going to say was I think it is interesting, isn't it, about, and it was always the debate between the issues of key public policy and the issues, i.e. health, social care, criminal justice, rehabilitation, education, whatever it is, and the sector. And part of the point, and this is where I really agree with Campbell, part of the point of putting the Office of Third Sector Civil Society at the centre was because they then can have an overview. I think the reality is, it's a middle-ranking minister, whoever it is, I bet we don't yet know, because I bet it isn't one of the ones that's yet been appointed. How interesting. In terms of the list, it came, well after employment and whatever the other ones, in international development and so on. I do think, and I think it's an interesting question, it's not a criticism of colleagues there, but actually, in theory, you've got to be engaging with those public sector reforms agenda from the beginning. And that's part of the debate, I think, about the nature of the Cabinet Office, which, of course, has lots of people thinking about public service reform, with and without the relevant secretaries of state, and all that debate which goes on in all governments. I mean, I've seen it both in this government and previous governments. So I think there's something about, we need to recognise that for a lot of charities, you are focused on the particular nature of your beneficiaries, but actually the point that I think Clare made, I think very powerfully about behaviours is, actually, why do politicians get involved in the first place? I mean, I've worked with local and central government politicians for many, many years, and there's lots of things good with them and lots of things bad with them, and like the rest of the world. But at the end of the day, most of them get involved because they actually want to make a difference in some shape or form for some particular group of people or some particular cause. And one of the things we have to work out is what you do in central government and what you can do in civil society. And there is something about that mutual respect, but also that mutual respect to have kind of challenging ideas. So I suppose I'm saying is that I think it's important that civil society organisations are involved in the policy debates. It isn't just a debate between politicians about how you deliver better social care or better rehabilitation of offenders. Actually, the charity sector, in all its shapes and forms, should be actively part of that debate. And so that, to me, would be one of the things is government should let in the charity sector and practitioners to help shape the policy debate.
Lucy, just before you stop, since you're an ex-Treasury person, Campbell made a very big thing of the fact that the office couldn't work unless the Treasury were really behind it.
And he's absolutely right. And without putting too fine a point to it, remembering Gordon Brown was then, as Campbell well knows, was then the Chancellor and was playing a very, very major role on a whole number of really profound things about the voluntary sector. So cross-cutting, there'd never before been a Treasury-led cross-cutting review on the voluntary sector, which, if I remember rightly, one of the two at least you actually worked on, Campbell. So I think the notion that the Treasury was interested was important, and it may have changed and policy changed, but the concept that actually this matters, and debates about VAT and the rest of it went back then.
Okay, thank you. Actually, what I'll do is I'll take the one at the back and then quickly come back to you and then take 3 or 4 more. And if everyone's well behaved, we can get through them all.
Thank you, I'll try to be. Richard Harris, I'm the Deputy Director of the think tank Reform. I was also the former civil servant who was winking madly at Campbell at the start. I worked at the ACU, the ACD, temporarily at the VCGU, it became the OTS, and of course now it's the OCS. The fact that we like to rename it says a lot, doesn't it? Campbell's not going to like this because it's more of a point than a question, but I'll try and tack a question mark on the end. The point is that Campbell was a very effective Director General, absolutely without a shadow of a doubt. But the question is, in a sense, what did that deliver? I mean, obviously being a very good Director General in Whitehall is important at the Institute for Government. At Reform, we tend to pay more attention to the outcomes of government policy. And it's very interesting that actually just before the Office of Civil Society was set up, volunteering reached a sort of height, and then it started to decline at a pace. It's now, of course, back at record levels, and that's a good thing. And indeed, despite the 2008 crash, charitable giving, the actual charitable income overall, has continued to go up. It's gone on a bit of a slower rate, but in real terms, it has continued to go up. There's more money going into the voluntary sector now than there has ever been. It's just not from government. And that in itself speaks surely to a very powerful point, that if the job of government is to ensure a healthy voluntary sector, well, job done, we can go away now.
Thank you. You're wading into one of the most controversial areas, is the data about how much funding there is into charities at the minute. I can tell you that academics argue that one endlessly. Is there any quick comments just on those 3 before? Otherwise, you'll lose touch with.
No, it's all right.
Campbell, do you want to say anything? What were the outcomes in your period?
It depends on. It depends entirely on the outcomes that you wish to achieve. Shelter uses a community centre around the corner from us on Old Street called St Luke's, which was a dying on its feet community centre, which should have been heart and soul a part of a community, and had run down to its feet. It's now, as a result of direct funding from a community grants programme which Richard was involved in setting up, which is now the most vibrant community centre you could wish to be in. It helps employment, it does old age things, it does absolutely everything, hires out rooms, it makes money. So depends on the community, it depends on the outcomes that you wish to achieve. As a direct result of it, I don't walk in there and say, I funded this, thanks very much, I want a discount for shelter. But you can, it depends on the account. I do think generally, and there is an absolute distinction to be made. If you set up a unit to set up to encourage giving, then it should be judged on whether it should set up giving, and you set up to do that. I think those are, giving and volunteering are touchstones of a good society. They always have been, and we should judge them on whether they're good or not. Whether it's the role of that office or that unit to promote them is entirely up to them. If you set up a unit to fund programs and to try and encourage and to get a voluntary sector to grow and get better, then it's judged on different things. It entirely depends on what you want from the unit in the first place.
I'm just adding rather interesting, very important to the charity sector, interaction with government. And obviously, one is setting up a big society capital, which I guess the office plays some role in, and also the steers that are given to big lottery, which is also a rather murky area, but rather important, particularly to the sector. Claire, I'll just ask you, one of the points made was that the sector's kind of so diverse now, this is all ridiculous, and having an office that represents it all is madness, and we shouldn't try.
Well, yeah, I suppose it depends what else you do with the money. I mean, so I think it's never an absolute question, isn't it? It's what about this, or what's the alternative? So if the alternative was to spend the money on grassroots charity provision for some of the beneficiaries of some of the great causes, I would have a big struggle. I'd have a big struggle with it, to argue for a bureaucracy rather than some direct service provision.
Well, there we go. That's a brave thing to say, a bunch of civil servants in the room. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, and then 4. And that's probably going to do it. Depends how long you talk for.
Hello, my name is Carol Hayden. I work for a research consultancy called Shared Intelligence. But before that, I worked in government at the Neighbourhood Renewal Unit in DCLG, as it is now, which was a cross-cutting unit trying to work more closely with community and voluntary sector as well as local authorities. actually putting the points from Clare on behavioural change and the limits of trying to make change through new structures, albeit the importance of maybe having some sort of central unit, I'd have thought the most important outcome for the Office of the Third Sector, or whatever it is called, is to actually achieve major behavioural change in the civil service, so that it actually can have those debates, those dialogues, those conversations with the voluntary sector in its widest, wisest form. Because despite the importance of having champions in some departments, which is important, unless you actually get the change so that it makes sense for civil servants to start talking with the voluntary sector, where they're thinking about changes to policy, changes to ways of delivering services, those changes will not happen, and the voluntary sector will not be more involved in this mixed economy of service provision. And I think it's more difficult even than it was now to do that. Two reasons. One, I think you're working against sort of civil service training, what civil servants are trained to do, the culture in the civil service. And we were involved with Collaborate and the Institute for Government in doing this research on commissioning in the social sector. And I found out from interviewing senior civil servants and other commissioners in local authorities that actually there's a feeling that the new commissioning arrangements through using primes and long supply chains to smaller voluntary bodies has actually affected adversely the relationship between government and the voluntary sector. And I was told by civil servants time and time again that actually there is less relationship with the voluntary sector now. Now, partly these reforms were brought in to do that. Civil servants also said about how difficult it was working with and paying goodness knows how many hundred voluntary bodies when you could use 10 primes, for instance, in the work programme. But ironically, it's also made it more difficult because there isn't that contact anymore with the providers of those services.
Thank you. Interesting observations. Gentleman next to you.
I suppose I'm one of those academics who criticised that I was chair of two charities. My name's Alex Murdoch at London's South Bank University. I'm curious because government mainly passes laws, and there's been several laws passed, including the Social Value Act. And those laws, to some extent, have been permissory rather than mandatory. And I'm just curious as to the views as to whether you would welcome mandatory legislation or whether you feel permissory legislation that enables things to happen that previously were obstructed. Which do you prefer?
Nice question, and the lady in front of you.
Thanks very much. I'm Christine Elliott, Chief Exec of the Institute for Turnaround. I've also worked for a long while in the voluntary and public sectors. Couple of issues really, the main ones being inequality, and I want to pick up again on diversity. On inequality, I think the question anyway answers itself before the question mark. There is a relationship there, and it's a question of do you let it rip or do you manage it? And I suggest the latter is preferable. Having said that, managing it is not through the lobbying restraint measures now being proposed, which actually are a form of financial and linguistic censorship, in my view. But I'd just like to come on to the use of language and diversity, because I've heard a lot about diversity from the platform, but not actually seen much evidence of it. That telling picture of the lovely, well-arrayed tulips and the random, wild flowers and all the rest of it, actually those descriptions could equally apply to the opposite parties, depending on your viewpoint. Now, a relationship between government and the voluntary sector is crucial to close the widening inequality gap. We can't afford not to have it there if you look at the evidence referenced by Piketty, Krugman, Wright and others. So the point that I'd like to make is what we're seeing is opposing homogeneities and actually a bit of genuine diversity, not groupthink in each of the parties, would be tremendously helpful to building the constructive relationship that we need.
Thank you, and Jill here.
Hi, I'm Jill Rutter from the Institute for Government, and we are interested in outcomes, Richard, so just watch that. I just wanted to ask, we focus very much on the sort of fluffy, enabling, nice capacity building outreach bit of the government relationship. But in a sense, isn't the more important relationship with government with the voluntary sector the regulatory relationship and the charity commission? And I just wondered whether, if you were paying attention to that, whether you thought that actually was functioning well, and whether I never quite understood whether there's also as non-ministerial department, but Nick Hurd sort of is the minister, even though you have to find it absolutely buried in the documents before they admitted it, and they still haven't appointed a minister for the voluntary sector, as far as I can see. So I just wondered whether the OTS had a view on actually how to get that regulatory relationship right, which strikes me as, you know, the bit you can't opt out of, however much you might want to.
Okay, there are lots of different questions there. Let me start off with Danny, particularly that question about things like Social Value Act and so on, which in some ways are supposed to make it easier for social enterprises and non-profits to get access to contracts rather than just being forced down to lowest price. I mean, is it a useful thing? Is it any case for it having more teeth, or is it a bit of an irrelevance?
I think it's a great step forward, and interesting that it took a private member's bill to happen at all. But I suppose they had to give it time, so in a sense it's had some backing. I think the evidence is that people don't understand it. Community groups, charities potentially bidding for work don't make the case in those terms, particularly commissioners don't realise their obligations under it. I think there is I think there probably is a next step, and whether that's about I think there's two ways we do it. One might be, as you say, permissive, which is around enabling a valid sort of judgment about what social value constitutes, and maybe some sort of index, so that it's possible to kind of quantify social value. Obviously, incredibly difficult challenge, but enabling commissioners to award contracts sort of in plain sight on social value, rather than making some sort of subjective judgment. I think there's an issue around the clarity of the concept still that has to be filled in. And the other one might be much more radical, which is to require commissioners to hand out a proportion or some, I don't know kind of how it would be done, but some sort of obligation on them to commission services from firms or charities which deliver social value. I mean, I think there's a huge amount that could be done locally and centrally. I don't know why absurd example, but why those little, we haven't got any, but the little name plaques you get in every government meeting are all made in prisons or by firms employing ex-offenders, for instance. There's so much spending that goes on that could be delivering a huge amount of social value without any reference to sort of wider obligations. Just simply, where's the money? The government spends such a huge amount of money on sourcing stuff. Let's give them the power to source goods as well as services from social value organisations.
You got any thoughts on that, Campbell? And also on this issue that actually whatever this office is, its real role is to kind of change the culture of the civil service rather than do anything else.
Well, I think there's a number of different things going on. I think the point about the way that commissioning is going in big government departments is absolutely right. It was happening 5-6 years ago, and it's now in its fullest form in transforming rehabilitation welfare to work, where the government has a model for operating now, which excludes almost nearly every non-profit and charitable organisation from being a prime. You know, you cannot shelter. Leonard, Cheshire couldn't be a prime. We're not big enough. We're nowhere near big enough. You'd have to be 5, 6, 10 times as big as us, and our trustees wouldn't take the risk with our donated income to become a prime. So we are moving into an era, whether we like it or not, where large-scale commissioning is our relationship will be with private sector companies, and that's a whole different thing. And actually, in many ways, my experience of working with them is they're actually better than government in some ways. They pay on time, they understand the bottom line, they don't have politics, there isn't politics involved and politicians involved. So actually, in some ways, the relationship with the private sector can be much more meaningful and much better in some ways. But that does, I think, absolutely go to the point that you're making, that it will change the relationship between the civil service and government. So you may need a completely different office to do that. Now, whether that's right or wrong, whether that's the right way the commission should go or not, it doesn't really, in terms of from now for the next few years, that is the way that is happening, and that's the way that voluntary organisations will have to interact and understand that. So I think that we do need to think about how you deal with that. I think that, and so the culture in the civil service may be irrelevant in that sense going forward, because actually it's the culture in private, in capitas and the circles of this world, and what they understand about the voluntary organisations may be more important for those who want to deliver large-scale civil public services on a scale. So I think that's an important point. I think, but it is still important that that the government, and I absolutely agree with Danny, the actual drive for this has to come from the very top within government. And I think actually he's right that the big society, I actually was in a sense in favour of the big society. Big society was the ultimate expression of what I'd been trying to do for 10, 15 years, is to genuinely get people at the very top of government to recognise that society is beyond democratic politics, that there is so much more that goes on in every one of our societies that needs to be encouraged and developed and pushed and made to happen, because that's how you make society and communities better. And it's a shame that it got tied up with a whole set of other agendas which weren't irrelevant to that. But at its heart, we want a civil society that takes the most vulnerable in society and gives them the opportunity to have a voice, to have a say in their community. That's absolutely brilliant. So if we can have more of that, then that's brilliant. But we're a long way from it at the moment, but from both political parties.
Okay, and Clare, on this culture thing, because you talked a lot about that, if we all behaved decently to each other and understood what we did. But you've worked in Whitehall. How are we going to do that? Is an office part of that, or is that irrelevant, or is it just lots of secondments? Or how do we change that? Easy thing to say, difficult thing to do.
I'm sort of havering about whether it's good manners to say this or not.
Say it, go on.
I think a bit of professional competence around commissioning would sort a lot of this out, actually. I was one of those nerdy people who used to really, really enjoy reading contract documents and invitations to tender. And I could really rarely interest anybody else in them. The only time that many senior civil servants get interested in these documents is when the contract's in trouble. So it's usually a few months after it's been signed as things start to go awry and there's press coverage, and then they're really, really interested. It's almost impossible to get anybody at any sort of senior level interested in commissioning before it's signed. And it's so important, because all you can do afterwards is alleviate the worst possible consequences. And I'm sorry, because I know it goes against the whole trust of delegation, empowerment. I'm just here to manage the relationship with ministers and go and make speeches and talk about values. But actually, somebody at the top of the office needs to read these contracts and make sure they're doing the things you want them to do. Because I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a room with councillors and ministers, and they've talked to me about, oh, isn't it shocking all these people are on minimum wage, or oh, isn't it shocking the work programme's not working. Not surprising at all. Look at the criteria in the contracts. It's obvious. It was always going to be like this. We told you it was going to be like this. You write treat officially on it, put it in the out tray, and lo and behold, this is what happens. Social Value Act, all very nice and lovely, but a bit of professional competence would sort out a good lot of it.
Okay, I'm going to call it to a halt there, so that we can all get away and enjoy the sunshine on our way back to work, obviously. I think one of the interesting things here is there's been a kind of agreement for everyone and all the contributions that one way or the other the voluntary sector is not only vital, always has been, always will be, but is getting more vital, partly resource issues, partly vibrant democracy and so on. And therefore it's going to have some sort of relationship with government, whether that's national level or local level, but that's tricky because by definition it should be slightly, almost confrontational, not in a sort of nasty and rude way, but that's its role really, and we have different roles. So how we make that work still, I think, remains a very important thing. We've mainly talked here about issues to do with in Cabinet Office, but I think they're very serious issues about how departments operate with all this. I mean, certainly at MPC we were very surprised when we did some work recently on philanthropy, and we talked to the OCS. We said we'd like to present this work to, presumably you've got a philanthropy network or something with lots of departments like DCMS and health and education all looking for philanthropists, but there wasn't. There aren't a group of them who, so presumably they're all chasing the same people and talking to the same foundation. It's completely crazy. And things like that can be sorted out through process. I shudder to think a committee or an office or all the rest of it. So I think one thing's clear is this is an important debate which isn't going away, and we can probably do things better, but I don't think we've totally found the answer from here, which is very good news for the Institute of Government because they can carry on doing some work. I'd like to thank the speakers who've been terrific today, and let's hope we have a minister for this area soon.